Hello and welcome to everyone to this EPC policy dialogue titled Middle East in 2025 Between Risks and Opportunities. My name is Mihai Chihaia. I'm a policy analyst here at the EPC and I have the pleasure to moderate this discussion. The event today is part of a series that we started towards the last year, a series that looks at developments in the region and a series that aims to bring together different voices to unpack these developments. Today we're gonna have a forward look at 2025. We've seen 2024 has been a very turbulent year in the region with many developments in different avenues. So the aim today is to look a little bit what might happen during 2025. Of course, what has already happened. We've seen many developments on the other side of the Atlantic in DC with Trump administration. We also see developments when it comes to EU policy towards the Middle East, while at the same time, there are already many developments in the region. I'm not going to get into this at this point. That's why we have an excellent panel today with us, and I'm just going to introduce them one by one. We have today with us Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at Carnegie. Welcome again at the EPC events, and thank you very much for joining us. We have Katarzyna Sidło, who's a Senior Analyst at the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Welcome and thank you for joining us. And last but not least, we have Ambassador Hesham Youssef, who's co-founder at Diplomeds, the Council for Mediterranean Diplomacy. A couple of thoughts on the run of show. Today we're going to have a conversation with our speakers for about 20-25 minutes, and then we'll directly open the floor for Q&A with the audience. To ask a question, just type it at the bottom of your screen in the Q&A box. I will read it out loud, and then we'll see who is best placed to address it. I will just encourage you to pose your questions early on. We have only 1 hour today, and the experience from previous events was that many questions come in right towards the end. So it would be best to have them beforehand, so we just have enough time to address all of them. And without further ado, I will start with you, Aaron. And I think my first question is whether you can give us an overview of Trump's approach to the region so far. Of course, the most important development is his Gaza plan. So it would be interesting, of course, to hear your thoughts on this, but also more broadly at what has been Trump's approach to the Middle East so far, and what should we expect next. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Mihai. It's great to be here with Katarzyna and Hesham. And thanks to EPC for doing this. Look, I've studied the presidency. The last book I wrote was called The End of Greatness, Why America Can't Have and Doesn't Want Another Great President. I think that Trump is unusual, to say the least. He's coloring outside the lines, both at home and abroad. His major focus is not abroad, it's at home, where he is crashing through any number of institutional and constitutional norms. America is already in a constitutional crisis. There's no doubt about it. We haven't yet seen it highlighted where a standing court order enjoins the president to do something and he simply says, I'm not going to do it. That test may or may not come with a Supreme Court ruling. Abroad, he's a very transactional man. I think Trump 1.0 has only given us a taste of the reality that he has no real conception, in my judgment, of the national interest. His policies are tethered to a number of I guess, sensibilities. He wants to assert American power without deep American involvement. He is risk averse when it comes to the issue of the projection of American military force. This pertains to the Middle East clearly, even though he's promised or referred to the fact that he'd be willing to send American forces to Gaza. I think that's a proposal untethered from reality. You all remember the efforts of the Defense Department to create last year a marine bridge to deliver humanitarian assistance at the cost of some $300 million. It fell apart as a consequence of heavy seas and logistical issues. I also think that he really does want to see wars, conflicts ended. The question is how and at what price. In the Middle East, I think he has two major objectives when it comes, and I'm not sure the Middle East is a priority, but I think by and large, Donald Trump perceives the region as he said as much with respect to Syria, but I think with the exception of Israel and the Gulf, it probably pertains. Middle East is an area of sand, death, and destruction. That's how he's described it. I think he cares greatly about the Gulf. The Gulf will be the primary focus of his activities. Why? The Gulf has hydrocarbons. The Gulf has Trump's financial interests and his business dealings, which have only increased on the part of the Trump Business Organization. His son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his son, Don Jr. I think he does, even though at the White House he said he would never get a Nobel Peace Prize. I think he is focused on doing some diplomacy. He'd like to see an Israeli-Saudi normalization. He doesn't know quite how to get there. And he'd like to see the situation in Gaza ended, although through his own actions, I think he is actually risking a perpetuation of the conflict. One last comment. The Gaza gambit, to me, I had 27 years working for Republican and Democratic administrations. The Gaza gambit is a proposal untethered from reality. We don't know precisely why the president came out with it. It's conceivable that he saw it as a way to stir things up in the Arab world, to get key Arab states to stand up and do more with respect to Gaza. But the way he's framed it, my final point, the way he's framed this proposal, I think is both provocative and frankly dangerous. It's tethered the United States to an idea of forced transfer. Palestinians will see it as ethnic cleansing. He's validated the fantasies of the Israeli right wing, including the prime minister. He's undermined both Jordan and Egypt. And he sent a powerful signal to President Xi and Putin that if you want to take territory, simply assert it in a press conference and claim without justification that you have the right to do so. This is only the third week of the Trump presidency. I would caution all of you to buckle your seatbelts, particularly on Russia and Ukraine, because the European stake here, frankly, it's less the Middle East that will suffer as a consequence of European interests in this region. It is Europe that is going to bear the costs, I fear, of what Trump has in mind with respect to Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you, Aaron, for this scene setter, and thank you very much also for bringing Europe in the discussion. Before moving on to Katarzyna, I just have one follow-up question on the ceasefire in Gaza. How do you see it moving forward? What are the chances to move, of course, to the next phases, or do you expect also the things to flare up from there rather than move towards a second phase and a more permanent ceasefire?
Yeah. From the beginning, I've held to one position, that is Israel and Hamas, because it is in their interest, will in fact implement the first phase. I believe that, and has said as much over the last 3 days when people thought this agreement was about to crater. But I'm equally convinced that moving from phase 1 to phase 2 will not be possible. The heavy lifts that phase 2 enjoin, Hamas to free the remaining hostages, and let's be clear, if phase 1 is implemented, Hamas will control roughly 59 Israeli males, mostly soldiers, half of whom the Israelis judge to be dead. They are obligated to return all of those hostages, dead and alive. Israel is obligated, as is Hamas, to end the war, and the Israelis are obligated to withdraw their forces from Gaza. I see absolutely no way that Hamas will, in fact, agree to this unless they receive ironclad guarantees that Israel will bring the war to an end and Israeli forces will withdraw. Nobody, not the US, not the European Union, is going to give Hamas that kind of guarantee. And Mr. Trump has all but sided with Benjamin Netanyahu's view that phase 2 also has to include another requirement, which is ending Hamas's political influence in Gaza, let alone its capacity to govern, and the expulsion of its senior leadership from Gaza. So no, we will face a crisis beginning the first week in March, assuming that the first phase, which has 2 more weeks, another 3 Israelis for a asymmetrical number of Palestinians this Saturday, next Saturday, and then the final 11, 3 Israelis who are alive and 8 who are dead. The return of the dead bodies, I might add, is going to re-traumatize the Israeli public. And I suspect it will not be in the direction only of pressing Netanyahu to get the remaining hostages out. I think it's going to generate anger and a desire for revenge.
Thank you, Aaron. You painted quite a bleak picture, but I'm sure we'll come back to this. I'm sure also Hesham has some thoughts on this. But now maybe to turn to you, Katarzyna, and I wanted to go back to Europe that Aaron has already hinted at and mentioned it. We move now, of course, in a new EU political and policy cycle here in Brussels. What should we expect from the EU when it comes to Middle East? Of course, it's stated as a priority, but speaking in more concrete terms, how do you see EU engaging with the region?
Right. Thank you, Mihai, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and speak alongside Hesham and Aaron, of course. Well, talking about the EU, so like you said, we have the new political cycle, we have the new commission, and we have a new DG dedicated to the MENA region. So that's one huge change. Previously, the countries in the Southern neighborhood were falling under the DG NEAR together with the Eastern Partnership countries and the Balkans, and the Gulf countries were separately under different DG INPA. So creating this new DG MENA for the Mediterranean is a big step. It's been advocated for some time by a number of people in the policy cycles. Most importantly, because the policies towards the countries that have a view of joining the EU were seen as being in need of separated of those for the countries that very clearly are not on the path of the EU membership. So I think this is quite welcome that we have the DG dedicated specifically to the Middle Eastern countries, and it's very welcome that it also encompasses the Gulf countries, the GCC, to put everything in one umbrella. So it kind of shows a willingness to have a more coherent approach towards the region. In terms of the framework, for now, the relationship with the region is being guided by various documents. We have this new agenda for the Mediterranean. Now, in the letter that Ursula von der Leyen kind of issued for the new commissioner for the Mediterranean, Ms. Chihaia, she says very clearly there will be kind of 2 major documents that will be guiding the relationship between the EU and the southern neighborhoods. So we will have the EU Middle East strategy. This has been postponed. So this is not in the action plan for this year. The Middle East strategy was supposed to be focused on Gaza reconstruction, on assistance to the Palestinian Authority, on a 2-state solution, but also on support to Lebanon. So this particular document has been postponed. And the view for this year, for the 3rd quarter of the year, actually is to have ready the pact for the Mediterranean. So kind of a new framework that will take over the previous one, the new agenda. Here we have 2 pillars, as announced. One is comprehensive and strategic partnerships. Some of them have already been signed with Tunisia, with Egypt, most recently with Jordan. So this part of this pillar of the pact in this new approach is kind of bilateral. And then we have a more multilateral approach, which is regional investment initiatives. And somehow the Trans-Mediterranean Energy and Clean Tech Cooperation Initiative is also supposed to be part of the broader pact. Now, I think what is a key takeaway from this is that the focus most primarily will be for the EU on migration security and energy security. So two things that are absolutely key right now for the EU, and kind of there's no question that those two priorities will be guiding the cooperation going forward for better or for worse. We can discuss this later on. Another priority that was enlisted in the Commission in the letter, which has been quite heavily criticized, especially among the countries in the southern neighborhood, which is one point on promoting the EU's role in the southern neighborhood. And the criticism here was that this is about kind of focusing on perceptions and kind of PR rather than policy change. But if you read this out of the context, it might seem so. For me, this is about kind of addressing the Russian disinformation and the kind of narratives that are coming mostly from Russia, but also from China. So it's not so much about creating alternative reality in which EU is the best, but rather countering the reality in which we have major disinformation campaigns coming from other global players in the region. I'll probably stop here, but I will be very happy to go later in a little bit more detail if there's interest.
Thank you, Katarzyna. Thank you for the points, especially for outlining this new EU integrated approach to the region and having everything under one umbrella. Also noted on the two sort of guiding documents, the EU Middle East strategy and the Pact for the Mediterranean, which are upcoming. If I may just stick with you for a moment, and I want to be sort of a little bit provocative here and ask you, what should we read into this postponement of EU Middle East strategy? Is this a political sign that there are other more important priorities than the Middle East, or is it more the cause of the context that we cannot speak yet of reconstruction of Gaza because the conflict might flare up again, as we heard from Aaron earlier?
So I think, first of all, there's very practical aspects to it. It's very difficult to kind of negotiate it, come up with two major documents, both the Pact for the Mediterranean and the Middle East strategy at the same time. If you want to do it well, and this is something that I think is absolutely crucial, to pay way more attention to including more stakeholders in the negotiations of the pact. The previous agenda has been major criticism that it came from Brussels, kind of top down. It wasn't really properly negotiated, not just with the partners in the south, but also with EU representations and kind of more EU stakeholders as well. Which is also why it's been moved. Originally, it was planned for the second quarter of the year. Now it's been pushed to the third quarter of the year to just give more time. So I think there's this practical aspect to it, not to do everything at the same time. But why the pact was chosen as to be the first one as opposed to the Middle East strategy, then I think you answered it already. There's definitely this aspect of uncertainty. It's difficult to, of course, there's work going on to work under different frameworks and with different partners. There's the Syria conference taking place in Paris just as we speak. There are different conversations where there's preparation for creation of assistance to the Palestinian Authority under two-state solution. But right now, as we see, the reality is there's no space for this kind of conversation yet. So I think it was both like those practical matters and the more kind of political aspects to this.
Thank you, Katarzyna. Now I'm turning to you, Hesham. Firstly, to thank you very much for joining us. My initial question for you would be looking, of course, more broadly at 2025. What do you see as, of course, the biggest risks, but also the opportunities in the region during this year? But maybe you'd also like to come in on some of the earlier points, especially on the ceasefire in Gaza, but also on the role of the EU with your, of course, regional and local perspective. Please, Hesham, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mihai, and it's a pleasure to be with Katarzyna and Aaron. Well, the level of complexity in the Middle East has been raised to the nth degree as a result of all kinds of developments, not only as a result of Gaza, but in the last decade or so. And I think we are dealing with somewhat like a failed or a vulnerable region rather than a normal region. We used to talk about vulnerable states and failed states, but we're talking about the vulnerable and the failed region from all the conflicts that we have, whether it's Yemen, Libya, Syria, and so on. So this is the situation. And then in addition to that, you also have tense relations between key allies in the region. So relations are not going that smoothly between even the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, or Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So there are some tensions even between key Arab countries that are supposed to be the best of allies. And then you have the neighbors that have a disproportionate interest and influence in the region, which are the region is mostly Arab, but those who have the most influence are mostly those who are around the region, namely Turkey, Iran, and Israel. And if we talk about Egypt, it is also Ethiopia in relation to the dam and its influence in the Horn of Africa. But having said all that, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains a core issue in the region. And we have seen in the last 15 months or so during the war how the situation in Gaza and the war on Gaza have resulted in an upheaval in the whole world, with activities from the United States to Europe to the Arab world and so on. And, after all this time, one of the longest wars in this part of the world, in as far as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is concerned, we reached a ceasefire that is really very difficult to maintain. And I agree with many of the things that was mentioned by Aaron. It is difficult. Of course, stage 2 is much more difficult than stage 1, and this is why they postponed it to stage 2. Will it continue? Well, as a matter of fact, it will depend on the United States. And the United States will have to play a role in making sure that this continues. Otherwise, the situation may explode. Now, something that was mentioned by President Trump lately in relation to the hostages. He mentioned that they all have to leave at the same time and gave a deadline and said, this is my opinion, but Israel can do whatever it wishes. Well, there was an agreement that was reached, and the United States is one of the guarantors, and this is not what the agreement says. So this adds to the complexity, and as a result, Israel became embarrassed to have a position that is lower than what Trump is asking for. So the situation will continue to be difficult, but I'm also worried about the implications in the future, because what are the implications for what's happening on the prospects of peace altogether? On the two-state solution, when we have the President of the United States asking that all the Palestinians living in Gaza leave Gaza and go elsewhere. And then we will, the US will decide who can come back and who doesn't and so on. And there is no clarity as to, what the position is. So in the first instance, he says, well, we will control Gaza. Then we will own Gaza. Then we will own Gaza, but we will not pay for it, and so on. And as far as who would live there, he said, well, we will, we'll have reconstruction, and then Palestinians can go back. And then other instances, no, Palestinians cannot go back, and so on. So this will result in all kinds of confusions and difficulties. The silver lining here is that this has pushed the Arab countries to have a common stand in saying no. It is difficult to accept that all the Palestinians would leave. So we're coming with another idea. And the King of Jordan, during his meeting with President Trump, indicated that Egypt is working on something that will be presented to Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the Palestinians in a mini summit that will take place before the summit that will take place in Cairo on the 27th of February. So we will see what kind of proposal that would be presented. And this proposal is not based on asking Palestinians to leave. So that is the fundamental difference. And it is also talking about reconstruction and then etc. And we will see what kind of offer this would look like after the consultations take place between these key countries, and then what the reaction of the United States would be. And then we'll see how things would move from there. A final point in relation to extremism. One of the earlier objectives of Israel in relation to this whole approach is to say, well, we want to see how we can achieve de-radicalization. And I think one of the key points that was mentioned by Blinken before he leaves in session that he had in the Atlantic Council, he said that Hamas was able to recruit as many people as it lost in the war. So this means that we are moving in a direction whereby you are not able to advance the prospects of moderation, rather you are advancing the prospects of extremism. And this is what's happening both on the Palestinian side and sadly also on the Israeli side.
Thank you, Hesham. You brought some very relevant points. Thank you also for bringing the perspective of Arab countries on President Trump's proposal on Gaza. I also took note that a new proposal will be coming from the Arab states on Gaza. Perhaps here I would have a follow-up question without, of course, knowing any details of such proposal. What would be the chances for this proposal to gain traction? How feasible could this be? And then perhaps I will pose a question also related to this to Aaron and Katarzyna, which would be, what could be the role of the US and EU in taking forward such a proposal? But please, Hesham, go ahead.
Well, this depends on the scenario that would take place in stage 2 and stage 3. If we have stage 2 and stage 3 and we have some form of a permanent ceasefire of sorts, then this plan can advance. But if the situation flares up again and the war is resumed, then all bets are off. And then we also have Israel that has been saying for over 15 months that governing Gaza will not done by neither Hamas nor Abbas nor the PA. So this also requires some understanding and intervention by the United States in order for us to reach some understanding. Of course, Hamas will not govern. But the question is, who would govern? And to what extent you need the acquiescence of Hamas for this to be achieved without having to resort to an infight between Fatah and Hamas, maybe some form of internal clashes and so on, which is also another challenge that will be facing the situation in the very near future.
Thank you, Hesham. Aaron, Katarzyna, would you like to react now, or shall I already take some questions from the Q&A and then we can come back to you?
I mean, look, I would say this. The president believes that somehow, based on the reports he's received from his envoy, that it'll take 10 to 15 years, 5 years alone, to demine Gaza and to clear away the rubble. And his approach is to depopulate Gaza of Palestinians in order to allow this reconstruction process to continue. I find it inconceivable, whatever proposal emerges. There's supposed to be an emergency Arab summit, I guess, later in February. I find it inconceivable that Jordan or Egypt or any Arab state would be willing to absorb large numbers of Palestinian refugees even on a temporary basis, and temporary, as we know in the Middle East, ends up being permanent. So what proposal are the Arab states thinking about? The king, before his meeting, Abdullah, with the president, agreed to take 2,000 very ill Palestinian children. If we're talking about an Arab effort to step up to increase their humanitarian assistance, the UAE already operates or operated a field hospital. The Jordanians have been bringing in by helicopter humanitarian assistance, but this is not going to answer the mail. So this is just an effort to kick the can down the road. Sisi, as you know, I don't know if it's formal or informal, basically have let it be known that he's not coming to Washington unless Trump's relocation plan is taken off the table. So is the president prepared to suspend or restrict the $1.6 billion that the US provides to Jordan and the FMF? By the way, only 2 countries were excluded from the suspension of foreign assistance, Israel and Egypt, foreign military financing for both. I mean, this frankly is absurd. It reminds me of the old Soviet saw, the Soviet regime saying to the workers, we pretend to pay you, and the workers respond, and we pretend to work. I mean, this is a game, and it's a dangerous game. So it's almost and as far as phase 2, going into phase 3, what's most likely to happen is if phase 1 is not implemented in a way that you move to phase 2, first of all, there'll be a tendency on the part of the Israelis and Hamas to delay decisions. There is a clause in the agreement that says as long as negotiations continue, the ceasefire can continue. So it's not hard to imagine, since Israeli-Palestinian negotiations only have 2 speeds, which is slow and slower, this thing dragging into March. I don't think the Israelis have, in my judgment, I'm not an Israeli, I'm not giving advice to the Israeli Defense Forces. I think most Israeli Defense Forces would tell you, planners, they've run out of targets. The game now is keeping the war going, which is in Netanyahu's political interests, and getting the Arab states and the US to embrace the Israeli idea that Hamas's senior leadership, Mohammed Sinwar and a couple brigade commanders, need to be expelled from Gaza. If the Arab states bought into that and the US was serious about it, so the entire senior leadership was gone, I still think it would be problematic because the Palestinian Authority is in no position to be a legitimate governing authority in Gaza. I just think we are in for it may not collapse entirely, but it will begin to wither. I just don't see how you move into phase 2, let alone get to phase 3. Sorry to drone on. I didn't mean to take all that time.
Thank you, Aaron. Katarzyna, any thoughts on potential EU role in all of this on Gaza? Do you see the EU being present, having any influence on the dynamics on the ground?
Not really, frankly. I mean, so far what we've seen is the EU has had very little impact on what's going on in Gaza, and I don't think this is going to change. The EU is neither prepared nor really able to exert any actual real influence on the ground. What the EU might do is, after, just to continue issue statement, they support 2-state solution and so on, but prepare to provide some humanitarian assistance. But in terms of kind of the political weight given to what the EU has been doing, maybe some individual member state might play a more active role and want to do so. But the EU as the EU, this is a game, as Aaron said, between the US and some major players in the region. The EU is is out of it.
Thank you. I'm looking in the Q&A box and I see that we already have quite a lot of questions. I think there are about 7 or 8. So what I propose to do is that I read out loud 2, 3, or even 4 questions. And then we go back to you in a reverse order maybe. And then you can address whatever you feel that is in your area of expertise, if that's all right with you. So let's start. First question relates to Turkey. How does the EU balance its criticism of Turkey's domestic policies with its strategic need for Turkey's cooperation on Middle East issues, especially Syria? And then we have another question about the role and influence of other powers in the region, especially China and Russia. How do they position themselves vis-a-vis the developments in the region? And then a third question. I'm just paraphrasing because there are some of the questions are very long, so bear with me for a second. Relates also EU engagement. I know, Katarzyna, you already touched upon it now, but I'm still going to pose it. Is the EU really able to engage practically with reality in Syria, Israel, Palestine, and the Gulf? So perhaps just to rephrase it a little bit and to focus it more on EU's engagement with Syria and EU Gulf relations. So I'll leave it at that for now, and perhaps we can start with you, Hesham, if you have any thoughts on any of these points. Just briefly, a couple of minutes, and then we'll just go to each of you. Thank you. I think you're muted, Hesham.
2 points in relation to Syria and China and Russia. In relation to Syria, the challenge, the major, of course, Turkey has a huge role that has been clear in the last few weeks in particular. But I think the difficulty that we may be facing may be as a result of Iran and Russia. Iran feels that it has invested for decades in Syria and has lost a great deal, and Russia that has 2 military bases there. And for Russia, this is extremely strategic. So I think these would be much more challenging in dealing with Syria than Turkey, because Turkey, at the end of the day, has a difficulty in relation to Kurdish forces, but other than that will be much more flexible. The second point is in relation to China and Russia. I think this is one of the challenges that we will see in the very near future, because in this new Cold War or great power competition, the new administration would be putting a lot of pressure on countries in the region. And the countries of the region do not want to be a battlefield between these great powers on its soil. So we will see some tension as a result of pressure coming from both sides to advance cooperation and relations, and it will not be that easy to advance the situation. And this will become clearer once President Trump goes to Saudi Arabia and have discussions in relation to a number of issues, including Iran, including Yemen, including Ukraine, that will take place with Russia in Saudi Arabia, and so on. So yes, absolutely, this would be a huge challenge to the region and to the major powers as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Hesham. Katarzyna, before turning to you, I remember you also mentioned something about the EU efforts to counter Russian narratives in the region. So perhaps you can also look at this question through that lens. Please, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, Russia, of course, lost quite a lot, both in terms of prestige and in terms of kind of practical leverage in the region by the fall of Assad regime. But Russia is by no means out. We just heard about the phone call between Putin and al-Shara. Russians are evacuating their bases and they are moving to Libya. They just apparently were granted permission to have a base in the port of Sudan. So Russia is very much in the region and is very much strategic for Russia, both in terms of presence in the Mediterranean, for its naval strategy, in terms of being able to have a gateway to Africa, create trouble, but also sponsor the war in Ukraine by a way of smuggling gold and some other precious resources by way of over-sanctioning sanctions. So the region is really important for Russia. And the new Syrian government is, by maintaining certain line of communication with the Russians, it also have some kind of leverage over the Western countries as well by not getting rid of Russians, even though obviously they supported the Assad regime. So for Russia, not everything is lost, and it's both working actively in terms of military presence, in terms of paramilitary presence, but also in terms of this disinformation campaign. So this is a huge thing, perhaps bigger in the kind of eastern neighborhood, but definitely also influential within the EU and in the Arab countries as well. So this is and this is very good news that this is increasingly coming more and more up in the front of the EU agenda to address Russian disinformation, to counter it. And to actively also monitor it, first of all, actually to monitor it, to know how to counter it and how to disband it. Very briefly on other two questions in regarding to Turkey, I mean, the EU has to balance cooperation with many countries which it doesn't agree with. It's not necessarily agreeing with the model of many Gulf countries either, but with, as Hesham mentioned, cooperation with Turkey when it comes to Syria would be much easier. Than cooperation with, I don't see cooperation with Russia in the first place. In terms of being able to engage practically, the huge leverage of EU in the region is its economic power. It's a major trading partner. This is leverage it could use with dealing with Israel, but it's not. But it's a leverage that in general the EU has. So in terms of supporting any reconstructions effort in Syria, in terms of supporting the reform in Lebanon, this is definitely the angle that the EU can play much stronger role in than perhaps using it political weight, so to say.
Thank you, Katarzyna. Aaron, please go ahead.
I'll leave it to my fellow panelists to address these issues, but I would just note that we've now gone 45 minutes and there hasn't been a single mention of one of the, I would argue, I hold myself responsible. Of course, nobody asked me, but I'm putting it on the table now. We've gone for 45 minutes and there's been absolutely no discussion whatsoever of the one issue that could ultimately roil the region and create what it is now avoided, which is a multi-front confrontation. Iran. 45 minutes in this venue and nobody has mentioned Iran. The front page of the Washington Post this morning carries a story based on US intelligence assessments that the Israelis in the next several months are considering a preemptive strike on Iran's nuclear sites. I think that may well be what the American intelligence community believes. I'm not entirely sure the timing of that is right because it would mean American backing, because the Israelis can only do minimal damage, even if we supplied them with bunker busters. We're talking about setting back Iran's program weeks, months, if that. But that issue is going to be an EU issue, an American issue, and a global issue. I just throw it out there.
No, thank you, Aaron. Indeed, I had in back of my mind quite a few questions on Iran, but seeing
Right.
the discussion spread a little bit around, I think in 1 hour is always challenging to put all the issues on the table. But fully agree with you, Iran will be a very challenging topic for this year. May I just ask you a follow-up question on that? How is the U.S. administration positioning itself vis-a-vis Iran? I think we've seen President Trump reestablishing the maximum pressure approach, but what is the strategic thinking in the administration? And if I may just add one other question from the Q&A that attracted my attention, and it is addressed to you, Aaron. Just bear with me for a second to find it. Yeah, here it is. It's about Secretary Rubio's visit to Israel, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia from February 13. What may be the top goal and deliverables during Rubio's trip to the Middle East?
Right. I'll take that question. I'll venture an answer. I worked for half a dozen secretaries of state. To be a consequential secretary of state, you need three things. You need to be able to negotiate. You need a very close relationship with the President of the United States. And you need to own an issue. You need to identify one issue. You need to work it and to be successful in it. I see Rubio, frankly, I see that appointment as performative. Rubio is not close to the president. I don't know anything about his negotiating abilities, but this is a very controlling White House when it comes to foreign policy. The Biden administration was a very controlling White House when it came to foreign policy. The Obama administration, the same. The State Department has not played a significant role in determining policy, forget carrying out policy, in shaping policy for quite some time. I see Rubio's maiden voyage to the region as largely performative. The deal making will be done by Trump, and it looks like, even on the Ukraine-Russia front, by Stephen Witkoff. So I think I would keep my expectations very low. As far as Iran and the Trump administration, I think the administration will try to see whether or not a diplomatic off-ramp is possible. If it's not, for any number of reasons, I think the odds of an Israeli and or American strike would probably increase. I think Trump is very risk averse on this. I don't think he wants a major war with Iran. Precisely the opposite. I think he'd want a deal. And as he signed, as you know, as he signed the maximum pressure executive order, even as he was signing it, he said, I'm not happy about doing this. I really wish I wasn't forced to sign this. He wants a deal.
Thank you, Aaron. Going back to the Q&A and seeing that we have about 11 minutes left, I'm not sure we'll have time to touch upon all the questions, but I'm just gonna throw in another 3 or 4, and then we'll go for another round and try to cover some of the many topics that we have here. So just going through the questions. Does Saudi Arabia's ambiguous position, joining BRICS while maintaining diplomatic channels with the United States, represent a risk for US energy and economic policy, and a risk for defense contracts with US companies? That's one, well, 2 questions in one. Then there is another question. I think it's addressed to you, Hesham, since you mentioned the tensions between the major political players in the Middle East. How can the primacy of national interests influence or deteriorate relations with the US administration? And then let me put out another question related to Turkey. How does Turkey's newfound influence in the Middle East affect EU-Turkey relations? Keeping in mind that Turkey continues to occupy a new member state, Cyprus. All right, I'll leave it at that for now, and then perhaps we can do another round, starting again with you, Hesham. And if I may, I would actually throw in another question for you, not necessarily to come in on it in this round, but perhaps for another round, which relates to the Red Sea, which is another topic that hasn't come up in the discussion until now. Now we're at a period of relative calm in the Red Sea. How do you see the situation evolving in 2025? What is the risk that we'll go back to tensions and more Houthi attacks against shipping? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mihai. Very briefly, and I'll touch on three issues. One is Saudi Arabia and BRICS, because Egypt also joined BRICS and the United Arab Emirates. And I don't think that this will have a huge impact on the relations between any of these countries and the United States. As far as these countries are concerned, these countries view the relations with the United States as strategic. And as far as they're concerned, this is the most important relationship that they have in the world. So no country in the region will be working on something that will negatively affect the United States' interests. As to national interests and how this would, contradict with the relations with the United States, well, we've already seen part of that. Which is the visit by King Abdullah. King Abdullah was there and he was quite diplomatic, but at the end of the day, he said that this would be a national security threat if it is accepted. And this applies not only to Jordan, but it applies to Egypt and it applies to the whole conflict. This is a position that was taken based on principle, and I really do not think that this will change. And it is very complicated also from a political, legal, demographic, all kinds of issues, not for Egypt, but more for Jordan, but also for Egypt, And at one point in time, it was mentioned that those who will be allowed to go back are the moderates, and those who are extremists will not be allowed to go back. This means that you are saying to the region, we will keep the extremists in your countries, and we will allow those moderates inside. So what happens, as I think the president of Egypt mentioned at one point in time, very early on in the war, what happened if there are Palestinians who are on the extreme who came to Egypt and decided to attack Israel? Would Israel consider Egypt responsible, yes or no? Or will Israel respond, yes or no? And what would be the implications of that to the whole region? And this applies to Jordan as well. Jordan already indicated at the outset of the war that they consider mass displacement as a declaration of war. So this is how far they went in the first instance when the war started. So I don't think that this will change. The final point is in relation to the Red Sea. Well, the situation in the Red Sea has de-escalated to a certain extent, and there are companies that indicated that they will return, and there are other companies that said, no, we will not return until we are sure that the situation is stable enough for us to do so. So it goes back to what Aaron mentioned in his first intervention. Whether the war will be resumed, yes or no, and whether we will be able to go to phase 2 or 3, or whether the ceasefire will continue as long as negotiations continue as the agreement stipulates or not. Unfortunately, the drums of war are beating very, very loudly in Israel, and we will see what the implications of this would be to the stability in the region.
Thank you, Hesham. Katarzyna, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the question directed at me was about Turkey and its newfound power, how it affects the EU-Turkey relationship. Well, already Turkey has kind of a major strong card in its hands, and this is the migration card, of course. Like just the migration deal that was reached between the EU and Turkey. It just showed how very easily The EU overall migration policy and externalization of its border security can backfire, where basically the EU is exposing itself to potential blackmail. So, and Turkey knows this very well. So in that sense, EU's growing role in the region is only changing the situation that much. The situation is already that there is a lot of kind of imbalance in the power between the two. In some ways, it might be to the advantage of the EU in Syria. Turkey can play a very constructive role in many ways. So there's definitely a lot of scope for cooperation. The scope of cooperation that did not exist when Russia was behind the scenes in Turkey.
Thank you. Aaron, please go ahead.
I actually, I'm not sure I have much to add at this point.
Thank you, Aaron. I see that we have about 4 minutes left. There are quite a lot of questions that, of course, we won't be able to touch upon, and apologies for that. So maybe to end, I will initially what I wanted to ask you, of course, would be one thing sort of that we should keep our eyes on for the Middle East in 2025. But I think we covered this very well in the discussion. So I'm just gonna think a little bit outside the box at a question that goes a little bit beyond regional developments, and it's a question about leadership and what kind of leadership would be needed for long-term solutions, for long-term peace. I remember, I think in a previous event, we touched a little bit upon this with you, Aaron. I've seen also that Hesham has recently wrote an article regarding Jimmy Carter's leadership in the region. And of course, there's also the question about what kind of EU leadership is needed, would be needed for the EU to have a meaningful impact in the region. So I guess my question is, and feel free to approach it from any angle you want, is sort of what kind of leadership would be needed for a long-term to achieve long-term peace in the region. I know it can be difficult to sort of think long-term, but feel free to share your thoughts on this. And maybe if you allow me, I would start in the initial order with you, Aaron, and then go to Katarzyna, and then Hesham.
Right. Look, Mihai, I think you put your focus on what I consider to be the most critical issue. And it is the absence of leadership. It's not the only reason we find ourselves where we are in the region today. But based on my experience, the only time anything of positive value, certainly with respect to Arab-Israeli peacemaking, occurred, is when you had leaders who were relatively masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies, leaders who thought first and foremost about long-term benefits of peace and security for their respective peoples. Sadat and Begin, King Hussein and Rabin, even Rabin and Arafat in the first Oslo incarnation. And what we have today are politicians, or worse, we have a divided Palestinian national movement. It's broken, it's dysfunctional, it does not have a monopoly on the forces of violence within Palestinian society. We have an Israeli prime minister who's on trial for bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, whose every decision is influenced by his political calculations. And in Washington. So I wonder, and it drives me, unfortunately, to a very bad place. Because if, in fact, Mohammed Sinwar, Mahmoud Abbas, Naim Qassem, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, Benjamin Netanyahu, are the leaders with which we're going to have to deal, and even Ahmad Shara in Syria. I mean, Syria is going to be offline, preoccupied with its own internal developments for years to come, if in fact it can produce stable, functional, inclusive governance, which I doubt. So I worry greatly, and I wish I had an answer. Where do leaders come from? That is a key question.
Thank you, Aaron. Katarzyna, please go ahead.
Well, I'll maybe add to that the one crucial obstacle for the EU, and there are many, but one crucial obstacle for the EU to take any kind of leadership is that the foreign policy is not a competence of the EU, it's a competence of the member states. So there's only that much that the EU leadership can do. That's one thing. And second thing is that the internal division of powers within the EU leadership. So we have the Commission, we have the EAS, we have the Parliament. There are negotiations going on, how the EU member states are going to vote on certain issues. Are we going to move on from unanimity to the majority voting? With this being now, the EU being preoccupied to a large extent with those changes, but before those issues are resolved, again, the EU as a union has only that much power to take any kind of leadership in terms of the foreign policy. Maybe individual leaders from the member states could be doing more in the region, but then again, the weight of individual member state cannot be compared to the weight of the European Union combined.
Thank you. And Hesham, you have the last words.
Well, I will be brief. I think I agree with what was mentioned by Aaron and Katarzyna, but you know, there is another thing that we haven't discussed in this hour, which is democracy. And as far as our part of the world is concerned, I think also very little would happen without moving towards democracy. And then also to have more effort in relation to diplomacy rather than escalation, and balancing between internal needs and imperatives coming from abroad. I think the challenge is huge, but it's not only our region. I think there is a crisis in leadership in the whole world. And we see societies also moving to the right in different places around the world, making things much more difficult. So our work is cut out for us, not only in our part of the world, but in the world as a whole.
Thank you, Hesham, and apologies for going over time for a few minutes. We're now at the very end, which leaves me to thank you very much for your contributions, Aaron, Katarzyna, Hesham. Thank you very much for joining us today, and also to our audience. And we'll continue the conversation on many of these topics in the next iterations of our series of events on the Middle East. So thank you very much, and wish you a nice afternoon or morning.
Thank you very much as well.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.